September 2021, the autumn air carried the scent of pine and red clay through the remote hills of McCurtain County, Oklahoma. On County Road 47, a single unidentified SUV came to a stop outside a weathered farmhouse 30 miles from the nearest town. Inside, 68-year-old Pastor Gerald Matthews was preparing his Sunday sermon at the kitchen table. The same ritual he'd performed every Saturday evening for the past 27 years as the beloved minister of Broken Bow First Baptist Church. At 6:47, the knock was made. P.M. Intentional and formal. Reverend Matthews, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. In connection with Michelle Lawrence's disappearance and murder in 1991, we have a warrant out for your arrest. Later, the officers would say that the elderly pastor's hands never stopped moving across his notes, as if he were thinking about something else before putting his pen down. His voice was steady when he finally spoke. I wondered if you'd ever find her. The individual who had offered support to grieving people, families, baptized children, and preached about redemption had carried the darkest secret in McCurtain County history. He had worked with volunteers to search. He had prayed publicly for Michelle's safe return. He had even officiated the memorial service when Hope finally died. In addition, he had never revealed what he had buried in the Waseda National Forest in July 1991, when there was no moon. Please subscribe and like this video before we continue this shocking tale. Your support helps bring these forgotten tales will be brought to light, and the gods of algorithms will ensure that you don't miss any more uploads. September 14, 2021. In the Waseda National Forest, the first light of the day broke through the thick canopy of pine and oak, casting long shadows over a clearing that had been unoccupied for 3 decades. At 5:47 a.m., an Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation forensic excavation team had arrived. 32 miles northeast of Broken, their white vans were carefully parked in a line on an unmarked Forest Service road. The air hung heavy with moisture, the kind of oppressive humidity that made breathing feel like work. Detective Amanda Reeves stood at the perimeter of the cordoned area, a steaming cup of gas station coffee growing cold in her hands. She was the OSBI's Cold Case Unit's youngest lead investigator at 34, and this moment represented the culmination of 14 months of meticulous work that had consumed her life. The cadavered dog's findings had been confirmed by ground-penetrating radar 2 weeks earlier. In soil that hadn't been moved since the summer of 1991, something was buried here about 6 feet below the surface. "Doctor," yelled, "we're ready to begin." Patricia Morano, the forensic anthropologist who had driven in from Oklahoma City the night before. Her team of 4 technicians began the careful process of removing layers of forest debris, decades of accumulated leaves and branches that had concealed this spot as effectively as any intentional camouflage. The location itself was significant. This 17-acre parcel of land, technically within National Forest boundaries, had been leased to the Matthews family since 1967 for what county records described as recreational and hunting purposes. The broken windows and sagging roof of a small hunting cabin 200 yards to the west were evidence of years of neglect. Even though Gerald Matthews claimed to have stopped hunting in the middle of the 1990s due to arthritis, the lease had been maintained continuously by him, according to property records. Reeves had discovered this detail buried in a box of financial documents during a routine search of Matthews's home office 3 months earlier. Even though Matthews repeatedly told investigators over the years that he no longer ventured into the forest, the modest but consistent lease payments continued. Why keep a lease on land that you never use? The question had nagged at Reeves until she cross-referenced the property coordinates with historical search maps from 1991. The original search for Michelle Lawrence had come within a quarter mile of this exact spot. Volunteers had combed the publicly accessible trails, but this private lease area had been noted in search logs as cleared by property owner Pastor G. Matthews. No independent verification had been conducted. Reeves had stood on the warped wooden porch of Matthews' farmhouse on September 13th at 6:47 p.m., warrant in hand, and observed the elderly man's face as the words left her mouth. No one had questioned the word of a respected man of God. Pastor Matthews, State Bureau of Investigation of Oklahoma. In connection with Michelle Lawrence's disappearance and murder in 1991, we have a warrant out for your arrest. The moment had stretched impossibly long. She could see Matthew sitting at his kitchen table with paper spread out in front of him and reading glasses on his nose. He was alone. In 2019, his 43-year-old wife passed away, and he had 2 adult children who lived out of state. The house smelled of coffee and old wood, wholesome and ordinary. Matthews hadn't looked up immediately. He finished the sentence he had been writing by moving his pen across the yellow legal pad. When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, Reeves saw something she hadn't expected. Not surprise, not outrage, just a bone-deep weariness, as if he'd been carrying an impossible weight for so long that its release even through arrest brought a kind of terrible relief. He said quietly, "I wondered if you'd ever find her." Before carefully putting his pen down, "I've been putting my confession down. I guess I don't have to finish it right now." After 30 years of sermons, prayers, and public concern, here was a man who had been waiting to be caught, half hoping for it. Unable to confess but unable to fully hide. The words had sent a chill through Reeves that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. Now that Moreno was the doctor, his team meticulously worked through layers of Oklahoma red clay. Reeves became conscious of Carol Lawrence, Michelle's mother. She still lived in the modest house on Cedar Street, where she had raised her daughter. When she was 73 years old, Reeves had been visited by her to prepare for what was to come. "You found her," Carol had said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Her hands had trembled as she reached for the framed photograph on the mantel, the one that showed Michelle at 18. Graduation gown and mortarboard, smile wide and genuine. 30 years, 3 months, and 1 day. I've been counting. The excavation was entering its 4th hour when from the pit, Moreno yelled, "We have bone and textile fragments." The professional neutrality she possessed as a result of decades of dealing with human remains could be heard in her voice. But Reeves could hear the underlying note of satisfaction. Every cold case investigator lived for this moment, the instant when theory became evidence, when the missing became the found. Reeves descended the temporary ladder into the excavation site. The pit was precisely square, perfect walls vertical. The bottom is now showing what appeared to be human remains wrapped in what looked like worn fabric, possibly denim. The body was placed in a fetal position. Without a coffin or other formal preparations, the body was buried with hands close to the face. A hasty or panic burial, doctor said. "There's something else," Moreno said as she carefully removed soil from a location near the victim's chest with her gloved hands. "A book. Looks like it was buried with her." The object became more apparent as the soil disappeared. A hymnal, its leather cover stained and degraded, but still intact. On the spine, the gold embossed letters are barely discernible. Broken Bow First Baptist Church. A name written in fading blue ink was visible inside the front cover through the clear plastic evidence bag after it was carefully extracted. Michelle Lawrence. Reeves felt a tightening in her throat. This was the detail that would break the case wide open in the public consciousness. Not just a body buried in the woods, but a body buried alongside a church that never existed by a man who had been its leader for 27 years. The symbolism would be inescapable, the betrayal absolute. The excavation continued through the afternoon. Each bone was photographed in situ before removal. Meticulously cataloged every piece of evidence. By 4:30 p.m., Moreno had recovered enough of the skeletal remains, female, about 5 feet 4 inches tall, age that is comparable to late teens or early 20s. Cause of death would require laboratory analysis, but the skull's visible damage suggested a blunt force impact. Back at the McCurtain County Sheriff's Department, Gerald Matthews sat in an interview room waiting. He had invoked his right to an attorney, but then unexpectedly had begun talking anyway, as if a dam had finally broken after 3 decades of pressure. The video recording would later become crucial evidence, showing a man who seemed almost relieved to finally tell the truth. Matthew said in a whisper, "She was special," holding hands on the metal table folded. talented, pure. I told myself that I was guiding her and assisting her in developing her musical talents, but I was lying to myself. He paused and closed his eyes. When she realized what was going on and threatened to tell people about the letters I'd written and the inappropriate attention, I panicked. After the other people left, we argued in my office. She said she was going to the police. I grabbed her arm to stop her from leaving, and she pulled away. And he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the sentence. But the implication was clear. Violence had broken out as a result of the argument. A blow or push. A young woman falling, her head striking something solid and unforgiving, and then the deliberate decision to conceal what had occurred by burying the victim and the evidence in a location where nobody would think to look. Portable lights illuminated the excavation site as night fell over the Ouachita National Forest, casting stark shadows over the now empty grave. Michelle Lawrence's remains were being moved, transported to the Oklahoma City office of the medical examiner, where the final steps toward identification and ultimately justice were taken. Detective Reeves stood alone at the edge of the clearing, looking up at the canopy of trees that had kept this secret for so long. Carol Lawrence was waiting for the phone call that would confirm what she had always known in her heart, somewhere in Broken Bow. Somewhere in a holding cell, Gerald Matthews was beginning to comprehend the magnitude of his fall from grace. And in one location in the Dade Reese, the ghost of a 19-year-old girl with a beautiful voice could perhaps finally rest in the Oklahoma night. Michelle Ann Lawrence was Carol and David Lawrence's only child when she was born on March 3, 1972, at McCurtain Memorial Hospital in Idabel, Oklahoma. Her arrival came after 6 years of marriage and 3 miscarriages, making her what her mother would later describe as our miracle, our answered prayer. Carol brought her daughter home to the small house on Cedar Street, which still has the same faded blue shutters, and the idyllic spring day even though the neighborhood has changed a lot since then. David Lawrence held the position of foreman at the Weyerhaeuser lumber mill near Broken Bow for 32 years before the mill closed in 1998. Carol worked part-time as a seamstress, taking in alterations and mending from her dining room table, supplementing the family's modest income. They were working-class people in a working-class town, the kind of family where every dollar was accounted for and coins in a mason jar were the beginning of college savings. Broken Bow in the 1970s and 1980s was a town of approximately 4,000 souls. Nestled in the southeastern corner of Oklahoma, where the pine forests of the Ouachita Mountains met the red clay flatlands, the town's economy revolved around timber, tourism from nearby Beavers Bend State Park, and the small satellite campus of Southeastern Oklahoma State University. It was a place where high school football games drew half the town on Friday nights, where the 4th of July parade remained the social event of the summer, and where leaving your doors unlocked wasn't foolishness, but simply custom. Broken Bow was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business for better or worse, recalled Janet Morrison, who taught Michelle in 3rd grade at Broken Bow Elementary. If a child was struggling, the whole community rallied. Church congregations organized meal trains without asking if a family was struggling financially. That's the world Michelle grew up in, where trust was the default setting. From an early age, Michelle displayed a remarkable aptitude for music that seemed to transcend her modest circumstances. Carol recalled the first time she saw her daughter's gift. Michelle was 4 years old, sitting in the pew at Broken Bow First Baptist Church during Sunday service, when she began singing along to a hymn she'd never been taught. Not only did she sing the melody perfectly, but she also sang it in her small, clear voice. I looked at David, and he looked at me, and we both knew we were hearing something special, Carol recalled in a 2019 interview shortly before her health began declining. After the service, Pastor Harris, that was before Pastor Matthew's time, he pulled us aside and said, "That child has been given a gift from God. You need to nurture it." Private music lessons were out of reach for the Lawrence family, so the church community stepped in. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the church pianist for 43 years, began giving Michelle free lessons twice a week in exchange for help with yard work that David provided. By age 8, Michelle was singing solos during Sunday services. By 12, she was leading the youth choir. By 16, she had won regional competitions and received scholarship offers from 3 Oklahoma universities. Michelle's high school years at Broken Bow High School painted a portrait of a dedicated, somewhat shy young woman who found her confidence primarily through music. Her yearbook photo from 1990, her senior year, shows a slender girl with shoulder-length brown hair, warm hazel eyes, and a gentle smile that never quite reached the level of exuberance displayed by her classmates. In AP English, Robert Chen, who was seated behind Michelle, said Michelle was quiet, but not in a way that made you worry. She was just thoughtful, the kind of person who'd listened more than she talked. But when she did speak, it was always worth hearing. She didn't run with the popular crowd, but everyone liked her. There was a kindness to her that you just don't see that often. She came in 17th out of 84 students, particularly strong in music theory and literature. Her college application essay, preserved in university records, expressed her dream of becoming a music teacher, so I can help other kids find their voice the way this community helped me find mine. The sincerity and gratitude of the essay reflected her religious upbringing and working-class upbringing. In the fall of 1990, Michelle enrolled at Southeastern Oklahoma State University in Durant, 47 miles from home. She chose to commute rather than live in the dorms, partly to save money, partly because she remained close to her parents and felt no urgency to leave. She declared a major in music education, joined the university's concert choir, and took a part-time job at the campus library, shelving books for minimum wage. Her routine during those 2 years of college was predictable and purposeful. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, she attended morning classes, worked her library shift from noon to 4, then made the drive back to Broken Bow in time for dinner. She had labs in the afternoon and rehearsals in the evening on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Weekends were reserved for church activities, family time, and studying at the small desk in her childhood bedroom. Michelle was exactly the kind of daughter every parent hopes for, David Lawrence told investigators during the initial missing persons inquiry in 1991. She called if she was going to be late. She helped her mother with groceries without being asked. She saved her library paychecks for books and gas. She never gave us a moment's worry, not once. At Broken Bow First Baptist Church, Michelle had become an indispensable part of the music ministry by the time she was 19.
She was an assistant director for the youth praise team, organized the children's Christmas pageant, and sang in the adult choir. As a result of this position, she maintained regular contact with Pastor Gerald Matthews, who had joined the church in 1989 as an associate pastor and been elevated to senior pastor in January 1991. Matthews, then 48 years old, had impressive credentials when he arrived in Broken Bow. He held the Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, had served churches in Texas and Arkansas, and came with glowing recommendations. His sermons were praised for their intellectual rigor while remaining approachable, and his approach to counseling was praised for its compassion and wisdom. Within months, attendance had grown, and the church board considered him the best pastoral hire they'd made in decades. According to outsiders, interactions with Pastor Matthews began professionally and appropriately. He recognized her musical talent and encouraged her to consider leading worship music full-time. He offered to write letters of recommendation for graduate programs after graduation. He suggested a few more hymns that would show off her range of vocals. However, certain details acquired a darker significance when viewed through the lens of subsequent revelations. Matthews started setting up individual meetings with Michelle to discuss worship planning and spiritual development. On Saturday afternoons, when the church building was otherwise empty, these meetings typically took place in his office. He started giving her books from his personal library, writing messages on them that were not particularly inappropriate, but suggested a level of personal investment that went beyond pastoral boundaries. A diary entry from Michelle's junior year, discovered by investigators in 1991, but not fully understood until decades later, a brief notation was included. "Today, PM gave me another book. When asked once more what I planned to do after graduation, I responded, 'I have extraordinary potential and shouldn't limit myself to teaching in public schools.' He is very encouraging, but there are times when the attention seems excessive. Don't want to seem ungrateful." One of the most valuable resources for the investigation would be the diary, a small spiral-bound notebook with a floral cover purchased at the local Walmart. Michelle wrote sporadically, sometimes going weeks without entries, but her words provided insight into a thoughtful young woman navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood with more self-awareness than many give that age credit for. As Michelle prepared for the comprehensive exams required for her major in her final semester, spring 1991, the academic pressure mounted. In her diaries during that time, she mentions anxiety about keeping her grade point average up, worries about student teaching assignments in the fall, and exhaustion from balancing commitments at work, school, and the church. However, they also contain the first indications of her relationship with Pastor Matthews' discomfort. On April 17, 1991, PM asked if I'd considered staying in Broken Bow after graduation, maybe working for the church full-time. I informed him that teaching in public schools had always been my goal. He appeared dissatisfied, said something about how my gifts made public education spiritually dangerous. It was weird. May 22, 1991. Found another note in my hymnal after choir rehearsal. PM departed. I think just Bible verses about not hiding your light under a basket and answering God's call, but why not just talk to me instead of leaving notes? Mom says he's probably just being encouraging, but it feels different than when Pastor Hendricks used to mentor me. On June 30, 1991, PM wishes to meet on Saturday to talk about something significant regarding my future. He was very insistent. I have a weird feeling about it, but don't know why. Perhaps I'm delving too deeply into the details. The pastor is him. It is expected of him to be concerned about spiritual development. That Saturday was July 6, 1991. The meeting was referenced again in Michelle's diary, in an entry dated July 8th that would be among her last. The meeting with PM was uncomfortable. He talked a lot about spiritual bonds and special connections that aren't just between pastors and congregations. He did something he had never done before. He held my hand while praying. I pulled away and said I needed to go. He apologized and said I'd misunderstood. I do not believe I did. I need to talk to Mom about this, but I don't want to cause problems at church. He has everyone's love. Michelle never had that conversation with her mother. The next diary entry, dated July 12th, one day before she disappeared, simply read, "Choir practice tomorrow, dreading it. PM scheduled another meeting after. I'm going to tell him I'm not comfortable with these private meetings anymore. I'm 19, not a child. If he has something to say about church music, he can say it during regular practice sessions." On Saturday, July 13, 1991, Michelle Lawrence left her house at 5:15 p.m. for what should have been a routine choir practice. She told her parents that she would be home by 8:30 p.m. at the latest, wore jeans and a white cotton blouse, and carried her church hymn book and purse. Her mother later recalled that Michelle had seemed preoccupied during lunch, quieter than usual, but attributed it to tiredness from her library shifts. Carol Lawrence never got a chance to see her daughter again. July 13, 1991. Broken Bow First Baptist Church's choir practice for the evening was scheduled to begin at 6 p.m., additionally a weekly custom that had been unbroken for more than 2 decades. Michelle Lawrence arrived at 5:52 p.m. Her blue 1984 Honda Civic entered the church parking lot alongside 7 other choir members' vehicles. Security camera footage from the First National Bank across the street, reviewed during the initial investigation, captured her walking toward the church's side entrance, hymnal tucked under her arm, posture slightly hunched, as if bracing against an invisible weight.
The rehearsal proceeded normally according to the 6 other attendees. Michelle sang her usual soprano part, helped distribute sheet music for an upcoming service, and participated in the post-practice prayer circle led by Pastor Matthews. Nothing seemed to be amiss to casual observers, though Patricia Simmons would later tell investigators that Michelle had seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else. The rehearsal concluded at 7:23 p.m., slightly earlier than typical. For the next hour and 7 minutes, no one knew what had happened. Carol Lawrence first felt a flutter of worry when she glanced at the clock above the kitchen sink at 8:30 p.m. Michelle was naturally on time, and her arrivals and departures were as consistent as the church bells in the town. By 9:45 p.m., Carol had tried calling the church office 3 times, receiving only the answering machine. Patricia Simmons, whom she called at 9 p.m., confirmed that Michelle had been at practice but couldn't recall seeing her leave. "I remember Carol's voice on the phone," Patricia recalled in a 2015 interview, despite her best efforts to remain composed. A hint of panic was emerging. She kept saying, "This isn't like Michelle. Something's wrong." And we kept telling her that maybe Michelle had stopped somewhere, run into a friend, lost track of time. We were trying to reassure her, but we were reassuring ourselves too. David Lawrence drove the familiar route to the church after leaving the house at 9:17 p.m. Michelle should have been on her way in less than 7 minutes because the distance was only 2.3 miles. When he got to the church parking lot at 9:24 p.m., it was empty except for Michelle's blue 1984 Honda, which was parked in its usual spot next to the oak tree on the eastern edge of the lot. The vehicle was locked. The keys were in the ignition. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet inside containing her driver's license and $43 in cash. The hymnal she'd carried into the church was gone. Except for the glaring absence of Michelle herself, there was no indication of struggle, no broken glass, or anything else.
From the payphone outside the church, David Lawrence contacted the McCurtain County Sheriff's Department at 9:31 p.m. 12 minutes later, Deputy Thomas Riley and Sheriff James Hartley arrived. The church building had been unlocked and searched by 10:15 p.m. from the basement up to the bell tower. There was no sign of Michelle. At 10:47 p.m., Pastor Gerald Matthews was reached at his residence. He arrived at the church at 11:03 p.m. He continued to project the image of a man interrupted during a quiet evening at home, still wearing his reading glasses and carpet slippers. Diane, his wife, confirmed that he had been home since his 7:45 p.m. return from the church, where he had worked late to prepare his sermon in his office. Matthew stated, "I left right after the choir members did." Sheriff Hartley's initial declaration, "When I said goodnight, Michelle was getting ready. I assumed that she left just as quickly as I did. She seemed fine, maybe a little tired, but nothing concerning." Matthews shook his head when asked if Michelle had mentioned plans to meet anyone or go anywhere after practice. "I didn't hear anything from her. We didn't really have much conversation today." During the rehearsal, she appeared to be preoccupied. The assertion was in line with the other choir members reported, and Matthews' demeanor did not immediately raise suspicion. He offered to assist with the search efforts in any way he could, was cooperative and concerned. He even suggested that the church board release emergency funds to support the investigation if needed. Carol and David Lawrence were standing in their living room by midnight, surrounded by concerned neighbors and sheriff's deputies, attempting to respond to unanswered questions. "Have you seen Michelle in a while? What did she have on? Does she have issues with anyone? Could she have run away?" The questions seemed ridiculous. Michelle did not have any issues. Michelle did not flee. Michelle got back, except this time she hadn't. Sheriff Hartley decided to launch a comprehensive missing person investigation at 1:47 a.m. The McCurtain County Volunteer Search and Rescue Team was put into action at dawn. The church grounds and surrounding forest areas were designated as the primary search zone. Local radio stations were contacted to broadcast alerts when they resumed programming in the morning. It was overcast and humid early on Sunday, July 14. Over 60 volunteers had gathered in the church parking lot by 7 o'clock in the morning, including Pastor Matthews, who had brought a thermos of coffee and hiking boots with him. The search team covered the wooded areas behind the church, residential neighborhoods, the commercial district, and the trails into the AA National Forest in grids that were coordinated. The state police's bloodhounds tracked Michelle's scent from the church to the parking lot, then lost it, suggesting she had left the area in a vehicle. But whose vehicle, and why had she left her own car behind with her purse and keys inside? The search continued through Sunday afternoon and into Monday morning. The crews of local television news arrived from Fort Smith, Arkansas, and Oklahoma City. The image from Michelle's senior yearbook appeared on the evening news, filling screens all over the region. The Lorenians sat for a tearful press conference, pleading for information, for Michelle's safe return, for anything. David Lawrence pleaded, "Please, release our daughter," his voice breaking. "She's a good girl. She never hurt anyone. Just allow her to return home." Pastor Matthews stood slightly behind the family during the press conference, his hand resting supportively on Carol Lawrence's shoulder, his face a mask of pastoral concern. To everyone watching, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to act, as a spiritual leader who helps his followers through an unimaginable crisis. The investigation had gathered over 140 tips by Tuesday, July 16, 72 hours after Michelle's disappearance, but no concrete leads. Her case was reclassified from a missing person to a suspected abduction. In order to provide additional resources, the FBI was contacted. The search radius expanded to a 50-mile zone, and somewhere in the Ouachita National Forest, beneath 6 feet of Oklahoma red clay and 30 years of accumulated silence, Michelle Lawrence lay waiting to be found. The initial investigation into Michelle Lawrence's disappearance was hampered by the very thing that defined Broken Bow, its insularity. In a town where everyone knew everyone, the idea that one of their own could be responsible for harming Michelle seemed incomprehensible. The greatest obstacle to the investigation would be this collective denial. Let McCurtain County Sheriff's Department investigator Detective Frank Bowen approach the case with methodical precision. He had compiled a list of 23 potential people of interest by July 20th, 1 week after Michelle vanished. Every man who had been at or near the church that Saturday evening, as well as anyone who was known to have regularly communicated with Michelle, were on the list. The first suspect was Michael Garrett, Michelle's ex-boyfriend from high school. Before Michelle broke off the relationship in February 1990, they had been together for 7 months during their senior year. Garrett, now working at the auto repair shop owned by his father, subject to 3 interviews. His alibi was solid. In Idabel, he had attended a family barbecue with 17 people, including his current girlfriend. Phone records confirmed he'd made calls from his parents' house throughout the evening. Reluctantly, investigators cleared him. The second focus was on fellow students from Southeastern Oklahoma State University. 42 members of the choir, co-workers at the library, and classmates were questioned by detectives. Every interview portrayed the same picture. Michelle was well-liked, kept to herself, had no known conflicts or romantic entanglements. Jennifer Walsh, Michelle's study partner, told investigators that she was focused on graduating and finding a teaching job. She didn't date, didn't party, didn't do anything that would give anyone a reason to hurt her. By August 1991, Detective Bowen had eliminated all but 3 names from his suspect list. One was a wanderer who had been seen that weekend near the church but was later found in Texas and cleared through credit card receipts. Another was a former church maintenance worker with a history of minor theft, but his whereabouts on July 13th were confirmed through employment records at a construction site 30 miles away. The third name was Pastor Gerald Matthews, not as a prime suspect, but as a witness who needed to be interviewed more thoroughly. Bowen's thoughts are reflected in his notes from August 12, 1991. Matthews was the last person known to see the victim. Need to establish exact timeline of his movements after choir practice. Wife's alibi seemed solid, but window of 7:30 to 7:45 unaccounted for. Matthews was interviewed again on August 15th at the Sheriff's Department. Even though he insisted he had nothing to hide, this time he was accompanied by his attorney. The interview lasted 93 minutes and was recorded on cassette tape, a recording that would be digitized and re-examined 3 decades later with fresh eyes and new understanding. "I stayed in my office after everyone left," Matthews stated calmly. "I worked on Sunday's sermon. I remember hearing cars leaving the parking lot, probably around 7:25 or 7:30.
I worked until about 7:40, then locked up and went home. I didn't see Michelle after the practice ended. When asked if Michelle had seemed troubled or mentioned any concerns, Matthews paused before responding. She'd been quieter than usual lately. I attributed it to stress from school. I had offered to counsel her if she needed to talk, but she never took me up on it. Though impressed, did you have any private meetings that you had with Michelle in the weeks before she vanished? We met twice to discuss worship music selections. Matthews immediately responded, once at the end of June and once at the beginning of July. Both meetings lasted maybe 20 minutes. Nothing unusual. The answer was technically truthful but incomplete. Matthews didn't say anything about the books he had given Michelle, the notes he had written in her notebook, or the conversations that had made Michelle feel so uneasy that she had written about her worries in her diary. But when requested authorization to search Matthews' church office,
Matthews agreed immediately, signing a consent form and personally escorting investigators through the space. A large oak desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves dominated the tidy and well-organized office. Theological texts, sermon notes, and church directories were discovered by the detectives, but there was no evidence linking Matthews to Michelle's disappearance. What they didn't find, because they didn't know to look for it, was Michelle's hymnal. It had been removed from Matthews' office the night of her disappearance before burying it with her body in the forest. Investigators had no reason to believe Matthews was anything other than a concerned pastor, absent that piece of evidence and the diary entries that would not be fully analyzed until years later. The investigation had reached a dead end by September 1991. Over 200 interviews had been conducted. Searches had covered 340 square miles of surrounding territory. A profile that the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had created suggested that the offender was likely someone who Michelle was familiar with and had faith in, and possibly someone in charge of her. But the profile was too broad to be actionable. "We're chasing ghosts," Detective Bowen wrote in his September 30, 1991 case summary. "Every lead dissolves under scrutiny. The only tangible evidence is an abandoned vehicle devoid of any signs of struggle. Without a body, without witnesses, without clear motive, we're operating blind." The case remained officially active but with diminishing resources. Demand for new offenses' attention. Tips slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. The investigation was effectively put on hold by the first anniversary of Michelle's disappearance in July 1992. Though it was never officially closed. The suspension of active investigation felt like a second death to Carol and David Lawrence. The uncertainty itself was a form of torture in itself. Was Michelle alive somewhere, held captive, hoping for rescue? Or had she died that first night? Thankfully, her suffering was brief. The ambiguity ingested them. Carol began her own investigation by creating a huge wall chart in the spare bedroom to keep track of each tip, timeline, and theory. She put out flyers all over Oklahoma and the states nearby, spent money the family couldn't afford on private investigators, and she ended up finding nothing new. In the hope of gaining some useful knowledge, she attended each cold case conference within driving distance. David worked hard, working 2 shifts at the mill and avoiding the house where every room echoed Michelle's absence. His hair turned white within a year, and his shoulders remained hunched as if they were carrying an invisible burden as he grew older. On July 13, 1995, 4 years to the day after Michelle vanished, Pastor Gerald Matthews officiated a memorial service at Broken Bow First Baptist Church. Over 300 people attended, filling the sanctuary to capacity. A sermon about faith in the face of unanswered questions, about trusting God's plan even when it didn't make sense, was delivered by Matthews. Carol Lawrence sat in the front pew, clutching a framed photograph of her daughter as Matthews spoke about Michelle's beautiful voice and pure spirit. As he led the congregation in prayer, she prayed for Michelle's soul to be at peace wherever she was. She listened as he sang Amazing Grace, Michelle's favorite hymn, his voice steady and clear. And she never suspected that the man offering her spiritual comfort was the same man who had taken her daughter's life, who had buried her like refuse in the forest and returned to his comfortable life without missing a single night of sleep. Michelle's terrified eyes as the light left them. The memorial service ended with the congregation joining hands and singing, "It is well with my soul." Matthews stood at the altar with his hands raised in worship and tears streaming down his face. To everyone present, his grief appeared genuine, his compassion authentic, his ministry a blessing during unbearable times. It was a performance 30 years in the making, and it was flawless. The Broken Bow landscape was reshaped in both visible and invisible ways in the years that followed Michelle Lawrence's disappearance. Businesses changed hands, new families moved in, and the town expanded. However, Michelle's absence remained a wound that would never fully heal beneath the surface of everyday life in a small town, a mystery that defined an entire generation's understanding of their community's fragility. For Gerald Matthews, over the course of his career, he rose to prominence and gained public acclaim. 3 years after Michelle's death in 1994, the church board unanimously appointed him as senior pastor on a permanent basis, abolishing the interim position he had held since his predecessor retired. By the year 2000, Broken Bow First Baptist had more than 400 members, up from 180 under his leadership. A new sanctuary was built in 1998, funded partly by Matthews' tireless fundraising efforts. Matthews pastored Brenda Collins, who was the church secretary from 1993 to 2007, recalled that he had a gift for making people feel seen. He was able to recall everyone's names, birthdays, and challenges. He performed weddings and funerals with equal grace. People trusted him completely. Looking back now, knowing what we know, it makes my skin crawl. But at the time, he seemed like the embodiment of everything a pastor should be. Matthews had an impact that went beyond the walls of the church. He was elected president of the Oklahoma Baptist Convention in 2002, a position that gave him statewide prominence. From 1996 to 2004, he was on the Broken Bow School Board where he advocated for music education programs with an irony that would later come across as obscene. He offered support to the dying and their families, officiated at numerous weddings, and counseled troubled teenagers. Most disturbingly, Matthews maintained a relationship with the Lawrence family throughout these decades. He visited Carol and David periodically, ostensibly to check on their spiritual well-being and offer prayers for Michelle's case continue. He sent cards on Michelle's birthday each year, notes of simple hope for peace and resolution. He came to our house in 1998 when David was diagnosed with cancer, Carol Lawrence told Detective Amanda Reeves in 2021 after Matthews' arrest. He prayed with us in our living room. He held my husband's hands and asked God to give us strength. And the whole time he knew. He was aware of her location. He was aware of his actions. The degree of evil necessary to look a grieving mother in the eye year after year while carrying that secret, I have no words for it. David Lawrence passed away in April 2003, 12 years after his daughter vanished, without knowing what had happened to her. His obituary noted that he was preceded by death by his beloved daughter Michelle, whose memory he carried until his last breath. The funeral was officiated by Matthews, who gave a eulogy that praised David's perseverance and unwavering faith. For Carol, widowhood added another layer to her solitary vigil. She continued living in the house on Cedar Street, now surrounded by photographs of the daughter and husband she'd lost, a shrine to a life cut short. Michelle's bedroom remained exactly as it had been in July 1991. The diary, along with other personal effects, had been returned to Carol after the initial investigation yielded no breaks. She read and reread those pages, searching for clues that investigators had missed. The case itself underwent periodic reviews as forensic technology advanced and new detectives inherited the files. Using the most recent methods of fingerprint analysis, the original evidence was re-examined in 1998. Nothing new emerged. In 2005, Detective Maria Santos conducted a comprehensive cold case review, re-interviewing surviving witnesses and searching for inconsistencies in original statements. Her report concluded all investigative avenues appeared to have been thoroughly explored. This case can't be solved with the resources at this time because there isn't any new evidence or witnesses.
The 20th anniversary of Michelle's disappearance in July 2011 renewed media attention.
The Girl Who Vanished, 2 Decades Without Answers, was a long-form feature that was published in the Oklahoma newspaper. Former investigators Carol Lawrence and Pastor Matthews, who was quoted as expressing continued grief over the unsolved case, were interviewed for the article. "Not a day goes by that I don't think about Michelle," Matthews told the reporter, standing in front of the church where he'd last seen her alive. "I pray for her soul and for the peace of her family someday. This community has carried this burden for 20 years. Everyone wants a solution." The article provided suggestions, but none of them led to anything concrete. The case was once more pushed to the side of the community's consciousness, where it was occasionally mentioned, but it was increasingly seen as a tragedy that would never be solved. The breakthrough did not begin with shocking revelations. Rather, it began with bureaucratic modifications to law enforcement technology and staffing. A dedicated cold case unit with 4 investigators and access to cutting-edge forensic resources was established with federal funding in 2018 by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. The unit would be led by Detective Amanda Reeves, who was 31 years old and had 7 years of experience investigating major crimes. Reeves brought a fresh perspective shaped by modern investigative techniques. She had received specialized training in digital forensics, genetic genealogy, and psychological profiling of long-term offenders. In January 2019, she received the Michelle Lawrence case file, which contained 14 boxes containing documents, photographs, evidence logs, and recorded interviews from 3 decades earlier. "I spent 2 months just reading," Reeves later explained. "I read each and every interview transcript, witness statement, and called-in tip. I read Michelle's diary probably 20 times, and I kept coming back to one name that appeared throughout the file but had never been seriously investigated: Gerald Matthews." What caught Reeves' attention wasn't any single piece of evidence, but rather a pattern of small inconsistencies and omissions. On July 13, Matthews said he left the church at 7:40 p.m., but his wife said he got home around 7:45 or maybe a little later. Although the discrepancy was minor, it opened a time window that had never been fully explained. Matthews claimed that they had met twice to talk about worship music, but Michelle's, in addition to her notes in her hymnal, her diary mentioned at least 4 private meetings. Why would Matthews restrict their communication? Matthews' attention caused Michelle discomfort, according to her final diary entries. However, the initial investigation had dismissed this as typical teenage overthinking. In the 6 months prior to Michelle's disappearance, Reeves began creating what she referred to as a behavioral timeline of Matthews' interactions with Michelle. She spoke with former church members who had left, as well as those who hadn't been available during the original investigation. Michelle's experience was disturbingly similar to those of 3 50-something women who came forward to share their experiences. Rebecca Walsh had been 17 in 1987 when Matthews counseled her after her parents' divorce. During a phone interview from her Dallas home, she told Reeves, "He was very intense about my spiritual well-being. He insisted on private meetings, gave me books, told me I was special. I was uneasy, but I thought maybe that was just how young people's counseling worked. My mother pulled me out of the church because she didn't like how much time Pastor Matthews wanted to spend with me alone." In 1993, Jennifer Morrison described experiences that were comparable. "He followed a pattern. Young women in the church who sang or had musical talent, he'd single them out for mentoring. It always started innocently, but it would get progressively more intense, more personal. I finally told my parents, and we switched churches." Meetings were described by a third woman who requested anonymity. In 1996, that escalated to Matthews touching her hand during prayer, making comments about her appearance, suggesting they had a special spiritual connection. Matthews immediately backed off and became cold toward her when she resisted, eventually suggesting that she might be more at ease at another congregation.
The pattern was easy to see. Matthews had a history of inappropriate behavior with young women, particularly those involved in church music. He was calculated enough to stop before crossing legal lines, manipulative enough to portray his actions as a spiritual concern, and strategic enough to target people whose reports would not be believed. In March 2020, Reeves requested funding to conduct a comprehensive property search related to Matthews. She mentioned in her proposal that Matthews had held a hunting lease in the Watchan National Forest since 1967. This information was in financial records but was never looked into. The lease was 1.8 miles from where the initial 1991 search for Michelle was carried out. The money was approved, but the COVID-19 pandemic delayed implementation. Reeves was able to arrange for cadaver dogs to search the leased property in August 2020. The dogs, which had been trained to find human remains for decades, pointed out a specific area, about 200 yards from the abandoned hunting cabin. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the dogs' findings, anomalies in the soil consistent with a burial site. However, more than just suspicion was required to obtain a search warrant. Reeves needed probable cause, and after 30 years, that seemed impossible to establish. The break came from an unexpected source. In June 2021, a woman named Patricia Hantz contacted the OSBI tip line. She had been cleaning out her late mother's attic and found a box of letters from the 1990s. Her mother, Eleanor Whitfield, had been the church pianist who gave Michelle free piano lessons as a child. Among the letters was one dated August 1991, written by Michelle and apparently never mailed. The opening line read, "Dear Mrs. Whitfield, I need to tell someone what's been going on with Pastor Matthews. I'm scared to tell my parents because I don't want to cause problems at church, but his attention toward me has become frightening." The letter went on to describe Matthews' escalating behavior in explicit detail. The inappropriate comments, the unwanted touching disguised as prayer, the implications that Michelle was special to him in ways that transcended normal pastoral care. Most critically, it referenced a confrontation Michelle planned to have with Matthews after choir practice on July 13th. "I'm going to tell him clearly that I'm uncomfortable and that these private meetings need to stop. If he doesn't respect that, I'll have to tell my parents or maybe even the police. I don't want to ruin his reputation, but I can't keep pretending this is normal." The letter had apparently been given to Mrs. Whitfield for advice, but was never sent. In 2019, Eleanor had passed away without mentioning it, and her daughter only discovered it 2 years later while sorting through decades of accumulated correspondence. Armed with the letter, Michelle's diary entries, the pattern of behavior with other young women, and the cadaver dog's alerts, Reeves obtained a search warrant. The excavation began on September 13, 2021, exactly 30 years and 2 months after Michelle's disappearance. When the remains were uncovered along with Michelle's church hymnal, Reeves knew the evidence would finally speak louder than decades of silence. Although it would take several days to confirm Michelle's DNA, the presence of the hymnal with her name on it was indisputable. On September 13, 2021, at 6:47 p.m., Reeves stood on Gerald Matthews' porch with an arrest warrant. The man who had hidden behind a collar and a cross for 30 years would finally face earthly justice. Though no sentence could restore the years stolen from Michelle Lawrence, or return peace to the mother who had never stopped searching.
The interrogation room at the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Oklahoma City was deliberately austere. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 2 chairs facing each other across an unbridgeable divide. On one side sat Detective Amanda Reeves, a digital recorder between them documenting every word. On the other sat Gerald Matthews, 78 years old, his hands folded calmly on the table as if preparing to deliver a benediction. It was September 14, 2021, 18 hours after his arrest. Matthews had been read his Miranda rights, had consulted with his attorney, and had been advised to say nothing. Reeves couldn't quite make out what compelled him to speak, but he still spoke anyway. Not exactly remorse. Perhaps exhaustion as a result of carrying a secret that had become more difficult to keep each year. "I'd like to make a statement," Matthews said, his pastoral voice steady despite the circumstances. His attorney, Thomas Carrion, placed a hand on his client's arm in warning, but Matthews gently removed it. "No, Tom. Time has come. Past time." What followed was a 47-minute confession that would be transcribed, analyzed, and ultimately presented as the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Although Matthews' words were a liturgy of manipulation, violence, and calculated deception, they were delivered with the same measured cadence that he had used in thousands of sermons. "Michelle was special," he began, using the same word that had appeared in his notes to her, in his conversations about her, in his public statements after her disappearance. "Extraordinarily talented, pure in a way that's rare. I told myself I was mentoring her, helping her reach her potential, but I was lying to myself. The attention I gave her wasn't pastoral, it was personal, possessive." As if discussing someone else's sins, he described the escalation of his fixation with clinical detachedness. The private meetings that grew longer and more frequent, the gifts of books with inscriptions that went beyond the boundaries of their profession, the physical contact, and the brief touches that he justified as spiritual connection. "She began pulling away in early July," Matthews continued. "She stopped making eye contact. She found justifications to avoid being by herself with me. I knew she was going to confront me. I could see it building, and I couldn't allow that. My reputation, my ministry, my family, everything I'd built would have been destroyed by her accusations." After the conclusion of choir practice on July 13, Matthews had asked Michelle to stay for a brief meeting in his office after the other members had left. She had agreed reluctantly, bringing her hymnal with her, perhaps as a talisman of the sacred space that should have protected her. "I told her we needed to clear the air," Matthews said, his voice dropping slightly. "I said I sensed she was uncomfortable and I wanted to apologize if I had made her feel that way. She was relieved at first, thought I was going to back off, but then I asked her not to say anything to anyone. I said it would hurt the church, hurt her family standing in the community, hurt her own reputation. I tried to convince her that silence was the Christian thing to do." Michelle had said no. According to Matthew's account, she told him clearly that what he'd done was wrong, that she intended to tell her parents, and that if he approached her inappropriately again, she would report him to church leadership and possibly the police. "She stood up to leave," Matthews said, staring at his hands. "And I panicked. I grabbed her arm to stop her. She pulled away hard and I pushed her. Her head struck the corner of my desk as she fell backward." He stopped, his composure breaking for the first time, when he heard the sound. "Even after 30 years, I can still hear it. I hear it every night before I sleep." Medical examiner reports would later confirm that Michelle died from blunt force trauma to the occipital region of her skull, consistent with falling backward onto a hard edge. The injury would have caused immediate unconsciousness and death within minutes. But Matthews' response to that injury revealed the true nature of his character. "I checked for a pulse and there wasn't one," he continued. "I should have called for help immediately. Even if she was already gone, I should have called 911, told the truth, faced the consequences. But all I could think about was my life, my career, my family, everything I'd built. So I made a choice. The choice was to hide Michelle's body and construct a narrative that would deflect suspicion. She was wrapped in a tarp that Matthews kept in the closet of his office. He bought it to protect furniture during building renovations. He covered her body with boxes of church supplies before putting it in the trunk of his car. After that, he went back to the church office, cleaned the area where Michelle had fallen, and carefully set up the scene to make it look like nothing had happened. He drove home at his usual time, had dinner with his wife, and waited until around 10:30 p.m. until she went to bed. Diane Matthews regularly took sleep medication for chronic insomnia, a detail her husband knew and exploited. Once she was asleep, he drove the 32 miles to his hunting lease in the Ouachita National Forest, arriving around 11:45 p.m. The ground was soft from recent rain, Matthews recalled. "I brought a shovel from my garage,
It took me almost 3 hours to dig deep enough. I buried Michelle alongside her, still covered in the tarp, in the ground. I don't know why. Perhaps a twisted belief that she ought to be familiar with something, or perhaps I was trying to dispose of evidence. Even now, I'm not sure of my own motives. At 3:20 in the morning, he washed, put on his clothes, and went to bed after returning home. When the search began the next day, Matthews participated actively, projecting concern while knowing exactly where Michelle lay. Time would make it easier, I told myself. He said that eventually the guilt would fade, that I could compartmentalize it and move forward, but it never faded. Every sermon I preached, every prayer I led, every person I counseled, I was living a lie. And yet I couldn't bring myself to confess. The more time passed, the more difficult the confession became. So I just kept going year after year. When Reeves asked why he'd maintained the hunting lease for decades despite claiming he no longer hunted, Matthews's answer was chilling in its honesty. I couldn't risk someone else leasing that land, couldn't risk them discovering what I'd buried there. So I paid the fees every year, never visited, just kept paying to make sure that piece of earth remained undisturbed. The formal charges were filed on September 16, 2021. First-degree murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Matthews was denied bail given his age and flight risk. The arraignment drew national media attention, transforming a small-town tragedy into a cautionary tale about trusted authority figures and institutional failure. Carol Lawrence learned of Matthews' arrest from Detective Reeves, who made the notification in person at the Cedar Street house where Carol had lived for 53 years. The news that Michelle had been found, that her killer had been identified, that justice was finally possible. It should have brought relief. Instead, Carol's reaction was more complex. I should feel victorious, she told a local reporter 2 days later. But all I feel is tired, and old and angry about all the wasted years. Gerald Matthews stole my daughter. Then he stole 30 years of truth.
Even though he was aware that he had killed my child, he stood in my living room and prayed with me. That kind of cruelty transcends anything I have words for. March 2022 was set aside for the trial. But in February, Matthews' attorney negotiated a plea agreement. In exchange for prosecutors dropping the additional charges and recommending a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, Matthews would enter a plea of guilty to second-degree murder. Given Matthews' age and health conditions, including early-stage Parkinson's disease and cardiac problems, everyone was aware that Parkinson's disease and cardiac problems were effectively terminal illnesses. The plea hearing on February 28, 2022 was brief but emotionally charged. Matthews stood before Judge Rebecca Morrison and formally entered his guilty plea while donning an orange jumpsuit that was loosely fitting his diminutive frame. Before the sentencing, Judge Morrison allowed statements about the impact on the victims. 74-year-old Carol Lawrence approached the microphone carrying a written statement she had spent weeks writing. On July 13, 1991, Gerald Matthews took my daughter from me, she read, her voice wavering but determined. But his cruelty didn't end there. For 30 years he performed a grotesque pantomime of compassion. He visited my house. Together with my husband, he prayed. He sent cards on Michelle's birthday. Despite concealing the truth about what he had done, he looked me square in the eye year after year. She paused and supported herself by grabbing the podium. I'm 74 years old. I've spent more than half my life grieving a daughter whose fate I was unaware of. Now Michelle would be 50 years old. She had always wanted to teach music. She wanted to help children find their voices. Instead, hers was silenced by a man who claimed to serve God while serving only himself. For the first time, Carol looked directly at Matthews. I cannot pardon you. In this instance, I won't pretend that forgiving someone is good or healing. Your actions were unforgivable. I hope you live long enough in prison to fully comprehend the magnitude of what you demolished. Additionally, I hope that each and every night you can hear my daughter's head hitting your desk. May it haunt you to the end of your life." Matthews stared straight ahead with the same uninterested expression he had maintained throughout the proceedings, showing no apparent reaction to her words. Judge Morrison sentenced Matthews to life imprisonment without possibility of parole at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. He was immediately taken into custody and taken away from the courthouse in handcuffs, while a few remaining supporters wept in disbelief, and a crowd of onlookers yelled condemnation. The outcome of the case shocked Broken Bow and the entire religious community. Broken Bow First Baptist Church issued a statement in which they offered their support to the Lawrence family and any other individuals who might have been manipulated by Matthews, and expressed their horror at the revelations. The church board voted unanimously to remove Matthews's name from all plaques, awards, and memorial dedications. The sanctuary he had helped build was given over again without his name on it. Several other women came forward after Matthews' arrest, describing similar patterns of inappropriate behavior during his decades of ministry. While none of these incidents rose to the level of criminal charges, they painted a picture of a predator who had operated with impunity for years, protected by his position and the community's unwillingness to believe a pastor could be capable of such things. In a brief ceremony at Broken Bow Memorial Cemetery on March 15, 2022, the remains were finally laid to rest. She was buried beside her father, the two reunited after decades of separation. Carol Lawrence, supported by extended family and a few close friends, placed Michelle's high school graduation photo on the casket before it was lowered into the ground. Carol stated simply, "She's finally home. It's not the homecoming I prayed for 30 years ago, but at least now I know. At least she can now unwind." The success of the investigation rekindled interest in cold cases throughout Oklahoma and beyond. In lengthy dormant cases, Detective Reeves became a sought-after expert in genetic genealogy and behavioral pattern analysis. The methods used to solve the murder of Michelle were incorporated into national training programs. 19 months after his release from prison, Gerald Matthews passed away on November 3, 2023, from complications caused by pneumonia and heart failure. He was a 79-year-old man. His passing was briefly mentioned in the local newspapers, but generated little public interest. The man who had once earned the respect of thousands passed away mostly without a morning meal. His legacy has been reduced to a cautionary tale about how people cover up and keep their secrets. Carol Lawrence outlived her daughter's killer by 6 months. She passed away peacefully on May 17, 2024, at 76 years old. Her obituary noted that she was reunited with her beloved daughter Michelle and husband David. Among her personal effects was a worn leather journal containing 33 years of handwritten entries, one for each year since Michelle's disappearance. The final entry, dated 3 days before her death, read simply, "I kept my promise. I was always looking. Michelle is found. I can rest now." The house on Cedar Street was sold to a young family who knew nothing of its history. Michelle's bedroom, preserved for 30 years as a shrine, was repainted and converted into a nursery. The new owners planted flowers in the front yard, unaware that the previous occupant had tended those same beds while carrying grief that would have crushed most people. The location where Michelle's body was hidden for 30 years has been reclaimed by nature in the Ouachita National Forest. The hunting lease was terminated and the land returned to full federal control. No marker indicates what happened there, but the forest remembers. The trees that provided cover for an unspeakable crime now stand as silent witnesses to truth finally revealed. For Michelle Lawrence, justice came decades too late. It couldn't restore lost years or heal broken hearts, but it came. And in a world where so many voices are silenced forever, where so many crimes remain unsolved and unpunished, that matters. It matters that the Earth finally gave up its secret. It matters that science and persistence overcame time and deception. It matters that a young woman's violent death was finally recognized, mourned, and remembered not only as a mystery, but also as a person who deserved better than she got. The cold case was closed. The file, now complete with confession and conviction, was archived. However, Michelle Lawrence's story continues to serve as a reminder that sometimes silences are meant to be broken, that sometimes secrets are meant to be shared, and that justice, regardless of how long it takes, is still worth pursuing until the very end.